Good day, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are right now in the world. It's good evening for me, from me here in Singapore. And thank you very much for joining us in this very important and timely webinar. I'm Renzo Ginto. I'm an associate professor of global and planetary health at the Sing Health Duke NUS Global Health Institute at the Duke NUS Medical School, National University of Singapore. And I'm also a member of the Lancet Commission. And this webinar is brought to you by the O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health, which is hosted by the Georgetown University. Today, we are going to talk about racism, colonialism, and climate change, uncovering injustices in impacts and responses. And today we are bringing together a diverse set of panelists, thought leaders, advocates, those who are really leading the fight against climate change and health inequalities from different parts of the world. And today, and we now are seeing that our participants are starting to enter the Zoom platform. We will be hearing from our experts first, our panelists, and then it will be followed by a conversation. And we hope that our participants joining us from different parts of the world will ask questions, share their comments, and share their stories in relation to the topic of these convening. And you have the Q&A box for your questions and comments. And later on, we will be reading them and we'll make sure that you are part of the conversation. In the Lancet Commission, we are, trying to find solutions to, the issues that, affect global health today, especially issues related to racism, to colonialism, to structural discrimination. Our audience may be aware that in global health, we now have this emerging discourse around quote unquote decolonizing global health. Because we know that the global health sector, the global health field, global health science, the global health community is still very much dominated by certain sources of power. It's characterized by asymmetries in power, which then leads to gross inequalities and injustices in health. But today we're going to look at the intersection of racism, colonialism, health inequality with the climate crisis, which is perhaps the biggest existential threat that we are facing now as a humanity, as a human civilization. We know that in the next few weeks, the world's governments will again convene at the annual COP29, which will be happening in Azerbaijan. When we say COP29, it's been 29 years. Or for the past 29 years, countries have been deliberating, discussing on how to save the planet and how to save ourselves. But oftentimes the discussions, are lacking of different voices, alternative voices, not inclusive, not bringing in perspectives, especially from the marginalized and vulnerable populations of the world. And that certainly is very much symptomatic of the underlying racism and colonialism that still pervades in our structures, in our systems, even until today. So these are the issues that we are going to tackle, and we will be hearing stories, we will be hearing perspectives, we will be hearing the latest evidence on these issues, but hopefully towards the end, we will be co-creating solutions, decolonial, indigenous, anti-racist solutions to the climate emergency and to addressing health inequalities worldwide. So to begin, what I'm going to do now is to introduce our amazing set of panelists. coming from different parts of the world. And I will just be reading their bios very quickly. Our first speaker, you will hear from her later, Mita Huck. She's an early career researcher working with a race and health team at the University College London. She's been working on issues related to racism, child health, but also gender-based violence. And later on, we will hear from her the latest evidence on the intersection between racism, colonialism, climate change, and health inequalities. Then we will hear from Susana Almanza, who is the founding member and director of Poder, an environmental justice organization based in Texas, USA. She is an indigenous person of the continent of the Americas. She resides in Austin, Texas, a longtime community organizer and educator. And later on, we will hear from her vast and long experience in environmental justice activism, especially in the United States. And then we will hear from Elizabeth Coroy-Vulano, who is an emerging producer and director in New Zealand. Born and raised in Fiji, she began her career with Fiji TV at the age of 14, and she's been making films, documentaries that inspire, that tell the stories, especially of the Pacific. And later on, we will hear from her experience and also her art, and how her films and her art tell the story of the forgotten peoples of the Pacific Islands. And then we have joining us from Nigeria, Professor Kenneth Anchang Yongabi, a distinguished professor of public health and infectiology. He is a fellow of the African Institute of Public Health Professionals. And he also has been doing research on issues such as climate change, mental health, health literacy, indigenous knowledge systems, among others. He is also coming or joining us from the Imo State University and Claretian University, Nigeria. And then finally, we'll hear from Sandeep Maharaj, who is a pharmacist. He's a senior lecturer and director of the School of Pharmacy and director of the Entrepreneurship and Business Transformation Office for the faculty at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine, in the Caribbean. And he has also been working on issues related to climate change, health inequalities, mental health, especially in the Caribbean context. So we are bringing together a diverse set of inspiring academics, artists, and activists. Those are 3 A's. And I hope that the 4th A that we will come up with towards the end is action, right? What are the solutions and the actions, the activism that we will need to embark on, that we will need to do in order to save the planet, to save ourselves, and to fight racism, colonialism, and injustice. So now that I have introduced our panelists, we want to first make sure that we are engaging with our audience. You're not just watching us, we want you to be part of this conversation. And to do that, we have 2 questions that we are going to ask using Slido. I hope you're now seeing the QR code. You can also click slido.com. That's the code. And we want you to answer 2 questions before we begin the actual conversation. And so let's have the first question on the screen, please. So first, we want to hear where you're coming from. We already said the places where our panelists are coming from. In fact, we have even Elizabeth, who's joining us from New Zealand, and it's 2 a.m. in New Zealand. It's 9 p.m. here in Singapore. It's 8 a.m. For Susana in Texas. But how about you, our participants, our friends and colleagues and comrades from around the world? Where are you coming from? We would love to hear. And I'm seeing the different cities and the towns now in the word cloud. We have some cities in the States. Good morning to you. We have colleagues from DC, of course, because this webinar is brought to you by the O'Neill Institute for global and national law, health law based at Georgetown University. We have some colleagues from Trinidad, for sure, friends of Sandeep, and colleagues from the University of West Indies. But we also have friends from Europe. I can see Edinburgh. I can see, and of course, Asia as well. Good evening to you from those from Indonesia, from the Philippines. Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. From Singapore, where I am located now. Okay. Some friends from Africa as well. I think I saw South Africa. Okay. So thank you for joining us. And I hope that later on during the Q&A session, you will be sharing your questions, stories, perspectives. We will try to cover them all. We have an hour and a half for this webinar. And by the way, just to remind us all, I'm sure you've already seen it, this session is being recorded because we want to make sure that one, it's on our YouTube channel, and two, those who couldn't make it in this session can still watch this important conversation. We want as many people as possible to hear what we're going to talk about, the key messages, and of course, again, the solutions, the actions. So thank you very much to those who answered this first question. And we're a global family. It's great to see that we have participants from different corners of the world. Now let's answer the second question. What is the first word that comes to your mind when you think about the topic of today's webinar? I would like to remind you the title of our today's conversation: Racism, Colonialism, and Climate Change, Uncovering Injustices in Impacts and Responses. So, of course, apart from the terms that are already in the title, what else? What's the first term that comes to mind when you hear, a title such as the one that I just uttered, the event theme? So inequity and injustice are now tied. They're the biggest word so far in the word cloud. Capitalism, reparations. Okay, I'm seeing intersection, human rights, lack of inclusion, helplessness. But of course, I'm seeing some positive words like hope. Okay, but also imperialism and oppression, accountability, commitment, systems, developed countries versus low and middle income countries, the North-South divide, sovereignty, intersecting vulnerability. Okay. So thank you very much for sharing the words that are now percolating in your minds as you begin reflecting on the theme of today's webinar. And I hope that, one, we will be able to cover all these terms, all these concepts, all these ideas. But number two, hopefully we will also be able to, again, come up with solutions to many of the problems, the issues, the challenges that are enumerated in this slide. So thank you very much. And we'll keep a record of the terms that we have seen here, because hopefully when we ask you later another question, then hopefully we will see some progression, right, and improvement in terms of our understanding of the challenges, the topics that we will be discussing today. So now let's proceed with our conversation. And again, as I've mentioned, we will begin with an initial round of around 5 minutes opening statements from our panelists. And then I will continue with some follow-up questions. I will also be asking our panelists to react to one another. And then we will open the floor also for your questions. So without further ado, let's begin with Mita Huck from the University College London. Mita, thank you so much for joining us, and we're thrilled to have you in this conversation.
Thank you, Renzo. I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for having me on the panel. My name is Mita. I work with a research group at UCL, and I'm a member of the Race and Health Collective, and I'm on the steering committee for the Lancet Commission on Racism and Child Health. Um, our research group at UCL is part of a wider engagement project known as Envisioning Environmental Equity, a collaborative project involving research, activists, and community-based organizations in Brazil, Uganda, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka. We're interested in understanding the impact that racism and climate change has on minoritized communities, with a special emphasis on those in the most affected regions and young people. A part of our work included scoping the literature to see how well racism is represented in the climate and health literature. This is important because if the climate and health community are to respond effectively to this problem, then it needs to be reflected in the evidence, and the evidence needs to illuminate the many different faces of the issue, including the equity dimensions. Before I explain how we did this and what we found, I want to touch on an unavoidable but often avoided topic relevant to climate-related health inequities, and that's colonialism. Racism and structural discrimination organizes social, political, and economic power according to a social hierarchy. Through politics, policies, practice, and behavior, structural discrimination leads to health inequities for minoritized communities. This is a global problem, and while it looks different in every context, there is a noticeable pattern around how and why minoritized communities are demonized and the resulting health inequities. Colonial histories and ongoing exploitation help explain the origins of these health inequities. Colonial powers create social hierarchies which justify their conquests, shaping the global economic system that now drives climate change. These powers, implemented by discriminatory policies that still influence today's systems, reinforcing racial, ethnic, and religious divisions. Racism and colonialism remain key drivers of climate breakdown. As racism and structural discrimination are built into our society, the effects of climate change layer onto this framework, exacerbates the issue, but then also benefits from them. Racism and climate change share roots in colonialism, exploitation, and extraction, and this means removing and dispossessing land and natural resources for other means, often in the global north. That being said, I have a couple pictures to show you. So I'm going to share my screen briefly. Can you see this, friends? If you can give me a nod. Okay. So I want to first touch on unequal responsibility. Important to recognize that not everyone is equally responsible for climate change. Capitalism helps us explain why. The global north has exploited and extracted resources from the global south, leading to wealth in the global north. Although the global north makes up only 14% of the world's population, it's responsible for about 92% of excess CO2 emissions from 1850 to 2015. I'm going to briefly time down so we can make sure that your questions on mind. I want to also talk about our bodily response to racism. Colonialism and neocolonialism uses social difference to justify itself. This is not a harmless logic. Individuals experience the effects of racism throughout their lifetime and across generations. I'll go into what this means in just a moment, but before I do, I want to present this key concept. This is a piece of our conceptual model developed by the Lancet series on racism, xenophobia, discrimination, and its determination on health. The model essentially tells us how individuals and communities are impacted by racism across the life course, and this is a slice of what is supposed to be a globe. We are byproducts of our world, and when our world harbors structural discrimination at its core, we are undeniably impacted. Structural discrimination here means the use of social categories. And when I say here, I mean this little core slice. So here's the globe, and that slice taken out is that red. Structural discrimination means the use of social categories to create difference, separating those categories and placing them onto a social hierarchy. Institutions and systems include governance or organizations which distribute those resources. We are talking healthcare, housing, education, and legislation. They have the capacity to place those at the bottom of the social hierarchy at a disadvantage. This includes, and health systems are a part of this. Environmental factors at the spatial determination level also play a role. This could look like segregation, access to green space, air quality, etc. And communities refer to individual groups, be it ethnic or specific neighborhoods within a collection of individuals. And we did kind of briefly touch on what the individual health means earlier. So that model kind of looks like this in the long run. You can see that it happens across a life course, impacts of health, racism on health go across generations. So you carry the consequences from your ancestors and you pass those on. All right. So let's talk about the implications that climate change has on health in reference to this model. There's a lot of text on this. I don't want you to focus too hard on it. It's just kind of to help guide things. But if you want to take a screenshot, just note that each example comes from a specific reference that isn't necessarily generalizable to every context. So this is kind of a summary of the scoped literature that our team did. Most of the studies that we found came from the United States, many of which focused on heat, and other countries were represented to some degree, but not as much as the US, which kind of demonstrates the domination that the US has in this space. Um, in discussing our findings, we often try to highlight examples from across the globe, but I think that epistemic injustice is really important to recognize. So at the individual level, minoritized communities face increases in food insecurity and undernutrition, as is the case for indigenous groups such as Batwa indigenous communities in Uganda. A higher risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, as is the case for Black residents in Texas, who had 4 times a higher risk of PTSD compared to the white residents. They also face disproportional burden of occupational health risks, such as heat-related illness. In communities and spatial determination, you see that colonialism and MAPA regions coincide. So this means that formerly colonized countries are especially or disproportionately located in areas most affected by climate change. Residences and neighborhood infrastructure may not protect its residents after climate events or during extreme heat. This is especially true for Black and Hispanic communities in the US, living in the areas of US cities where temperature is higher on average. Within the health system, resources and the resources of the health system and its capacity to adapt to climate change in formerly colonized nations is limited, which contributes to a disproportionate burden of deaths in the global south. And barriers to health, such as legal status or affordability, are amplified. And this is especially pertinent to migrants, even traditional communities. Um, yeah. Institution and systems expose minoritized community to a higher proximity and exposure to pollution and toxins produced by fossil fuel and extractive industries, and intersecting forms of oppression, including disability, gender, socioeconomic status. These all kind of come together and form kind of a medley of harms that compounds all of the types of harms that I just listed, which then brings me to structural discrimination, which is, I think, a really key part of what we're talking about here and is at the core of climate and health inequities. Structural discrimination looks like extractive relationships between the global north and global south. That extraction dates back to colonialism and is reflected in even the helping professions that we're trying to establish now. These social hierarchies, which are created and reinforced, separated again to justify that extractive relationship, and tokenism and performity in climate action, when institutions or organizations or corporations want to say that they are participating and that they're helping often the global south, it is not necessarily taken all the way or embodied in the way that it needs to be. So that is it, the kind of individual kind of health related tier. I just want to zoom out for a second and talk a little bit about just where these health burdens fall. These maps demonstrate how health outcomes are unevenly burdened, particularly by countries along the west coast of the African continent. Um, this first map, or you can see it's labeled B, is the projected climate attributable diarrheal mortality in people aged younger than 15 years old. C is the same projection of climate change attributable population at risk for malaria. Maps D, so the one down on the bottom left, is the projected climate change attributable health related mortality in people older than 65. And then map E, which is the one on your bottom right, is the projected climate change attributable mortality due to undernutrition in children under 5. I know the text is really small, so that's kind of why I read it all out. If you need clarifications, we can always put that. But colonialism's legacy can, for example, nature preservation activities continues to displace indigenous peoples, and until COP27, no climate conference or the Conference of Parties was held on the continent of Africa, despite it being one of the most regions affected by climate change. Global South communities remain underrepresented in climate health, reflecting political legacies that favor the powerful, um, from international North-South inequities to national efforts and in-country efforts to retain power by further marginalizing communities. Our group has several recommendations to present to the climate and health community on how we'll move forward with this, but I believe we're going to discuss this later in the webinar. So I don't want to take up too much time. I just want to recognize my incredible EEE team, including Abby, who led the insights on this paper, Hazel from Climate Operation in Uganda, Priscilla from the Federal University of Bahia, Alab and John from Yakup in the Philippines, and our newest EEE member, MHPSS from Sri Lanka, and Sonora and Delan from my UCL team who support me endlessly. And importantly, the community members in each of these country contexts who have shared their perspectives with us on this issue. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mita, for that very comprehensive yet concise opening presentation, which summarizes, the evidence, but also, putting all these issues and aspects together in a unifying framework, which is going to be very helpful, especially for us who are working to, fight climate change and health inequalities and racism. You highlighted, the multi-level nature of the challenge, but also that it permeates throughout the life course. The trauma, the oppression, which then ultimately affect health outcomes. And you highlighted some of the different pathways by which climate change, racism, health inequalities interact. And maybe later on we can unpack them more during the discussion. So thank you very much, Nita. Now, from the evidence, let's hear from the stories from the communities and from our advocacy and the activism. And we're really, really privileged to have with us Susana Almanza, the director of Poder, an environmental justice organization in the United States. Susana, again, thank you, and we're eager to hear your perspectives.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. As I say, I'm Susana Renteria Almanza, the founder, member, and director of the environmental social justice organization Poder, Pueblo Organizado en Defensa de la Tierra y sus Recursos, in English, People Organized in Defense of Earth and her Resources. In 1991, a group of Chicana and Chicanos who had been walking in the steps of our elders and ancestors continued the struggle of addressing the colonization of our pueblos and our environment. In 1991, Chicanos, along with other people of color, challenged mainstream environmental group narrow view of the environment. These Chicanos were instrumental, along with other people of color, in redefining what was truly the environment. As Indigenous people of this continent, we always understood and honored our Mother Earth. We understood that nature kind and humankind were interwoven, interlocked, and could not be separated. We knew that the environment embodies where we live, work, play, and pray. For this new revolution was to address environmental racism and transition to the environmental justice movement. Poder became an affiliate member of the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice, SNEEJ, a multi-issue, multi-ethnic, multi-state network that covered Arizona, California, New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas, and geographically speaking, the nation of Islam. We joined the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Southern Organizing Committee for Economic and Social Justice, and the Asian Pacific Network, APEN. Together, we organized the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in October 1991 to build a multiracial grassroots movement around environmental justice. Summit delegates adopted the historic 17 principles of environmental justice. The environmental justice movement was instrumental in the 1994 passage of President Bill Clinton's Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice, the inclusion of grassroots representatives at the federal level, and the coverage of their flight, lodging, and meals. For those who didn't remember, when you went to Congress, you had to pay for your meals, your flight. We never low-income people of color and the frontline communities couldn't afford to be at the table. So the environmental justice movement forced and requested that the federal government give us a seat at the table and pay our flight, our lodging, and our meals. We helped create the environmental justice offices at the state level and the creation of the first National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and more recently, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and went on to get the Justice 40 initiative and much more. The EJ movement challenged NAFTA, fair trade agreements, mining on indigenous lands, pipelines, federal permits for polluting industries, and so much more. Now, heading back to Austin, in 1928, the city of Austin's master plan designated East Austin as an area where all industries, African Americans and Mexican American communities would relocate and reside. Prior to that, African Americans and Mexican American communities lived throughout Austin. And I have to say that these master plans were created throughout the whole United States, not just here in Austin, Texas, but throughout the whole United States. Although Austin has an image of a progressive city, poor race relations are at the heart of many issues. For instance, Austin was the only metropolitan city that had an at-large elections for city council members. We did not have district wards or smaller units of representation on the city council. In the 1960s, there was a gentleman's agreement that designated one city council seat for African American and one for Mexican American. These representatives were chosen by whites. On November the 6th, 2012, Austin residents voted and approved 10 single-member districts with the mayor at large. History was made. Austin zoning and land use is a code. The code is rooted in a history of racism and has fostered the wealth, security, and safety of Austin's affluent and middle-class white residents while failing to provide the same for our communities of color. It has served the interests of developers, the Chamber of Commerce, Austin Real Estate Council, Austin Board of Realtors, and the Home Builders Associations of Greater Austin, leaving Austin's neighborhoods of color with flooding, unsafe streets, inadequate access to healthy food, inadequate funded schools, and standard housing, and ultimately gentrification. For more than 35 years, East Austin residents lived next to several bulk fuel storage tank facilities known as a tank farm that devastated the land of our community. The tank farm was in a predominantly Latino and African American neighborhood. Millions of gallons of petroleum product were stored at the tank farm. The tank farm was a 52-acre site with the above-ground fuel storage tanks owned by 6 major companies: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, Citgo, and Coastal States. In 1992, Poder discovered that the companies had violated their air emissions and had contaminated the groundwater. There were numerous health problems in the community. Poder and East, the East Austin Strategy Team, which was made up of African American Neighborhood Association, sponsored a toxic tour of the area on February the 10th, 1992. Elected officials from city, county, and state level, as well as neighborhood associations, representatives, and school leaders participated. As a result of the support of several elected officials, community involvement, and continued queries by Poder and East, soil and groundwater contamination at the site were brought to light. In 1993, Poder's organizing led to victory. The tank farm was relocated out of the community, and the companies agreed to remediation. Later, the properties were rezoned to a less intense use. And I have to say that this campaign was done with a $2,000 grant, and we were able to kick the ass of multi-billion-dollar corporations in our community. The Holly Power Plant had noise levels that exceeded the Housing, Urban, and Development HUD federal standards for residential areas, and elevated the EMF, the electromagnetic fields. The Holly Power Plant was the largest stationary source of nitrogen oxide, which contributes to ozone. Several fires at the site raised additional public health and safety concerns. Bodez Young Scholars for Justice conducted a community health survey and participated in press conferences to voice community concerns. Ongoing community pressures led to City Council to close the Holly Power Plant on September the 30th, 2007. BFI, Brown and Ferris Industry, a multinational waste management company, was contracted by the city of Austin to collect recyclables such as plastic, glass, cans, newspapers for over 350,000 households. The East Austin site was located in the Gardens neighborhood and became a mini landfill, causing the infestation of rats and impacting the health of residents. This was a Latino and African neighborhood. The neighborhoods called for a relocation plan, and in 1996, the city bought the property and relocated BFI and rezoned the site to neighborhood office. The other big site was a pure casting industrial metal foundry. It was located at 2110 East 4th Street. It was located across from the Zavala Elementary School and in a residential area. Pure castings and numerous toxic metals. There's Young Scholars for Justice held press conferences and went door to door surveying and educating the community about pure casting. Their work with city council members, health officials, and other regulatory agencies to protect the health of the children in the community. Their demanded the relocation of the facility in 2018. They were successful in relocating the pure casting facility. In the Go Valley Johnson Terrace neighborhood plan, was approved by the City Council in March of 2003, making history. We made history along with the Garden Terrace neighborhood by rezoning over 600 properties from industrial to less intense uses and more compatible with residential areas, including this rezoning where properties were zoned, excuse me, industrial, but the actual use was residential. While numerous properties have been rezoned, many facilities which store hazardous chemicals are still located next to schools and in residential area. There continues to organize for relocation. The Guadalupe community was one of the first neighborhoods to be hit with a wave of gentrification. The newcomers obtained historic zoning, which exempt properties owners from paying most taxes. The surrounding neighborhoods, however, would have to pay exorbitant taxes. Escalating property taxes forced families to leave the community, and many families lost their properties. Gentrification is occurring at a faster pace in East Austin, now that it is designated the desired development zone as part of the city's smart growth initiative and due to the new zoning categories under the city's new neighborhood district. So Bodez Young Scholars for Justice participants participated in cleanup of the Oak Springs. One summer, they created a campaign that stated, whether you've done 4 years in Harvard or 4 years in Huntsville, that's a Texas prison, and you are no longer on parole, they call it off the paper, you have the right to vote. They educated formerly incarcerated individuals that have the right to vote. So we continue a lot of our indigenous campaigns and stuff. But I also want to talk a little bit about the climate justice framework. The climate justice framework does not reduce the climate crisis to a puzzle simply focused on counting carbons. Grassroots community-led movements around the world look across the economy at the exploitation of land, labor, and living systems, at the erosion of seed, soil, story, and spirit, and seek to lift up real solutions around us every day, from indigenous traditional knowledge, food sovereignty, decommodification of land, healthcare, and housing, to abolishing the military-industrial complex. From just transition and energy democracy, where democratized, decentralized, detoxified, and decarbonized energy powers our lives, to transformative justice, where we respond to violence and trauma with compassion and help, not policing, punishment, or prisons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susana, for your powerful testimony, for those stories that you shared with us, stories of struggle, stories of victories. You know, you highlighted the importance really of organizing and coming together. And later on, I would like to, you know, unpack that more, especially that, you know, all of us are watching at the United States as history and perhaps a tipping point is about to unfold in your country. And so I would love to hear your perspectives, but also maybe our participants do have questions and thoughts regarding what's happening in the States, which also will have definitely implications for us in the rest of the world. So thank you, Susana, for your message and your story. So now, from the United States, we will go back to, or we will forward, I don't know, we will move forward in time because it's 2 a.m. now in New Zealand. And we have Elizabeth Coroivulano, a filmmaker, who will share with us her experience, her observations in the Pacific. But before that, we're actually going to show to you the trailer of the documentary that was produced and directed by Elizabeth, The Forgotten Pacific.
I remember so clearly the moment I learned about climate change. Sitting in the classroom where my teacher wrote out the words on the blackboard. Carbon emissions are being trapped, it's warming our planet, sea levels are rising, which means islands would be gone within your generation, he said.
We've already lost islands, and now we're about to lose more because of the climate crisis.
No one wants to walk out the house because they feel like someone might be dead.
The Marshall Islands contributes 0.0007% of the world's global emissions. We're here facing the harshest challenges from climate change.
The hand that feeds this crisis is the fossil fuel industry.
In 2018, we got some stats that 89% of greenhouse gas emissions are being produced by the fossil fuel industry.
As I started understanding climate change, I realized that the very same thing that had nourished my family for generations, the ocean, could now potentially destroy us.
The forests are trying their best, the ocean is trying their best. Humans really should be trying their best too.
This is our warrior cry to the world. We are not drowning, we are fighting. On this voyage across the forgotten Pacific, we will meet my fellow warriors who are leading the fight to adapt, rebuild, grow, and save our islands.
Now let's hear from the director of The Forgotten Pacific, Elizabeth Coroivulano. Thank you so much for joining us. We're eager to hear your story.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me on the panel. Bulabinaka, my name is Elizabeth. I am a Fijian filmmaker based out of Auckland, New Zealand. In September, I released my first feature called The Forgotten Pacific. The documentary travels to 5 Pacific islands. Vanuatu, Fiji, Samoa, Tuvalu, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And we're looking at how the grassroots communities are weaving indigenous knowledge into the modern day fight to save the islands. How did I choose the 5 islands? We chose based on initiative that each island was focusing on. For example, in the Marshall Islands, their biggest campaign is on artivism, so looking at how art and creativity can catalyze social change. In Fiji, we look at the ocean, and we highlight that it is it's the largest carbon sink in the world, and it helps regulate the world's temperature, but she's struggling at the moment with the climate crisis. In Tuvalu, we look at how mangroves are their defense against king tides. And in Vanuatu, we look at a community that is constantly rebuilding because of the severity of the cyclones that they are facing yearly. The film's key message is a message of hope. It's a message of a resilient community in the Pacific, and it highlights the crisis that is happening, but also what the grassroots communities are doing. And they are not, it shows the world that they are not standing by and just waiting for things to change. They're enacting change, and they are taking their message all the way to COP. Every year, there's a big Pacific delegation that goes to COP. We are a small community, but we have a large voice, and there's a lot of push, and there's a lot of campaigning that happens at COP. And how do I think this film helps in the fight of climate change? I think it, first of all, highlights the crisis in the Pacific. And the Pacific aren't afraid to call out the hand that's feeding the crisis that we're facing. And it looks at a grassroots community group called the 3 Pacific Climate Warriors, and they're spread across 18 Pacific Islands. And now they're in New Zealand, Australia, and the US, looking at the Pacific communities there and how we can all kind of come together to get the message of saving the Pacific out into the world. Pretty much, yeah, that's it. That's the film.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I know you gave us both the trailer and a sneak preview of the film, but we are really looking forward to watching it in full. And I understand that it's actually available on YouTube. What's striking, so I encourage all the participants to take a look at the Forgotten Pacific online. But what's also striking to me, in your presentation was that, and in the trailer even, is that the Pacific Islanders really are, fighting, and they may be small islands, but they have a loud voice, and they're making sure that it's heard by the world leaders. But maybe the question is, how can we really make sure that their voices are truly heard, and that we really see the policies and the decisions and the transformations that are needed to save the Forgotten Pacific. So later on, we'll go back to that. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I just want to remind our participants that we have a Q&A box. We look forward to hearing from you. So please, if you have questions, you have comments, that's your space. We really want this to be an interactive conversation in a short while. So we want to hear from you, and hopefully, new questions and comments and insights are, emerging and coming up, and we would love to read them later. So now let's hear our 4th panelist. And from the Pacific, we will move to Africa. And we're joined here by Kenneth Anchang Yungabi. Professor Yungabi, thank you for joining us. And please tell us the story of Africa and also your work in fighting climate, health inequalities, and racism. Over to you, Kenneth.
Thank you very much, Renzo, and the team that is out there, and to all panelists and, of course, participants. I would like to share stories coming from Africa, but I want to take us But I'm going to introduce myself because I think Renzo has done a very good job introducing us, so not much time on that. Of course, I'm a professor of public health, and I work in Nigeria at Imo State University, and of course also Clarishan University, where I'm actually leading the health sciences department and a center for promoting indigenous knowledge, which is the only university center of excellence for promoting indigenous knowledge and wisdom. But I want to take on the topic, racism, colonialism, uncovering injustices in the climate space in terms of how do we respond to the impact. But I want us to reflect. Can you imagine a world? Just imagine that at the point of creation of the world, that we never had migration. Australia remained Australia, America remained America, African remains African, Asia, Asia. Just imagine that there was no transatlantic movement, no trans-Pacific movement. Now, and we all grew up in our various distinctive spaces. And then we came up to realize and discover ourselves. Now, the question I throw back to you, if you can reflect very carefully, would there be racism? Would there be colonialism? That's the thing. Now, just imagine that. Now, colonialism and racism began because of what? Migration. Now, if Christopher Columbus did not go to the US or Vasco da Gama to discover the world, should we be talking about racism? Should we be talking about colonialism? Definitely no. And if we were to be in that space and we grew up together to realize ourselves where we are, and we come to a dining table to share a cake, a piece of cake, I guess there will be equality and there will be equity, because we're going to speak from our various distinctive strengths emanating from our regions because we grew up together. So what I'm trying to say in this particular story is that because of migration, because of that movement, some people were captured and some lived in captivity. And that was the beginning or the genesis of inequality. So we need to look at that conceptual framework. And just imagine, should we be able to say that there would be a world ever where there's absolutely zero racism, absolutely zero colonialization or colonialism? Should we think about that? Certainly not in our lifetime, because there will always be what I will borrow from the medical world, subliminal or suboptimal racism, suboptimal colonialism will always be there. But what we're trying to do in this space, and I think that's what Georgetown University and the group Renzo is leading, is to look at how do we reduce that gap to the barest minimum. That's basically that. But certainly not, because I mean, in biological sciences, we have disease, we have genetic racism. We have genetic colonialism as well, where some certain diseases are prone to enjoy the melanin of the body. So this is something we need to know. Now, and I would liken this to biological sciences again and the study of immunology. Now, because of the fact that certain people were colonized, and because of the fact that certain races were discovered by another race, there will always be scars. And why am I saying immunology? There will always be some antibodies that reflect memories, the IgG, the immunoglobulin G, the gamma immunoglobulins, which means that there's a memory. That historical memory instigates and ignites the pain. And that's the fact about it. We are humans, we must understand this fact. So what I'm saying is all the efforts we are trying to put now is to be able to reduce that to the barest minimum in order to bring equality and equity. Now, the story of Africa, it was in the 18th century where the Europeans came to Africa and partitioned Africa into different portions. But then Africans were living as kingdoms themselves. You could hear of the Ashanti Kingdom in Ghana. You hear of the Benin Kingdom in Nigeria, the Buganda Kingdom in Uganda. So these kingdoms were there. You could hear of empires like the Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, the Sumanguru, the Songhai, the Timbuktu. They had their indigenous culture. These were original fabrics that were unperturbed until colonialization came in that 18th century, when the Europeans sat down together and said, let's partition this continent and give it to Europeans to rule. And that's where the cultural distortion began. Now, when the Germans were defeated in the war in that 1884, what happened? Because it was 1884 when Otto von Bismarck came to discover Africa. And if you look at the names of the countries of Africa, there are Europeans. For example, I would take, for example, Cameroon. Cameroon was named after the Portuguese Cameros. Now, based on what? They saw a river, and the river of crowns and all that. Nigeria from the river Niger. So all these names were names, European names. Now, if these countries still exist together today with the European names, how do you expect that colonialism and racism will be deleted from the DNA? Certainly a joke. So that's the story. So when this was done, there was distortion of indigenous culture. Now, in Africa, there is the culture of indigenous knowledge, indigenous medicine, and indigenous way of living, which was spiritual, which was inseparable from nature. Now, they had means of being able to dictate that there will be a rainfall. They had the indigenous indicators. They had, I mean, we have cultures in Africa, and I wouldn't want to delve into detail of that, where they will use bees as indicators to find where there is clean water. They had indigenous knowledge to prepare for an emergency preparedness in terms of heavy rains and heat and floods. They had all that. But the Europeans and the colonial masters said, no, this is bad. There is no science in it. So this is voodoo. This is skeptical, and there's no proof of concept. So they superimposed that with the Eurocentric knowledge. And what happens? Now, they were now funding this particular knowledge. Now, when they went back to Europe, the Africans cannot sustain. That's actually the story of unsustainable development in Africa, which stems from the fact that they had to depend on funding and support from Europe in order to grow the systems in Africa, because the indigenous systems were now abandoned to their fate. And that is the problem that occurs right now in the space of climate change. So there is colonialization in climate change. In terms of the response itself, when you hear of, Typhoon Ida in Zimbabwe or whatever, the response is very slow. But that same equivalent of that typhoon in Florida, this 24 hours is too late for any response from the American government to be able to come to that. So these are some of the issues that are there. So now you won't believe it. Civilization started in Africa, within the banks of the River Nile. The first writing in the world, the hieroglyphics, started from Africa, in Egypt. But they were abandoned to their fate because there was no scientific evidence. They were following a Eurocentric approach in order to validate, but forgetting that there are indigenous validation instruments and tools in order for sustainable independent development. And these things were not there. So what I'm saying is the climate change space, unless we go back to revisit indigenous knowledge on emergency preparedness, even in understanding, and I'll give you one example. There are trees in Africa whereby they are not supposed to be cut, but then they had a folktale and fables and stories that says that if you cut this tree, you kill the ancestors and blood will be oozing out of that tree. So people grew up in respect of that tree, and that was the indigenous conservation methods that they had. But then the whites said, no. The Europeans said, no, that's not the way it's supposed to be. What is the essence? So they were using Eurocentric methods. And now in the era of neocolonialism in fighting climate change, it's not going to really work in Africa, because who are the neocolonialists in Africa? They're Africans themselves who studied in Harvard, who studied in Wisconsin, who come back and then they discriminate the indigenous knowledge. They say, no, this is not the way it's done in Harvard. This is not the way it's done in Johns Hopkins. So these are the systemic and endemic issue that must be addressed. Now, the curriculum of the educational system in Africa, it is actually Eurocentric and Western-centric, curriculum. So tell me, how do we now create equality? So long as that is in existence, there's going to be inequality and disparities in health. So I'll leave you at this juncture. There are clear examples of it. Our work is addressing that. And we are saying for climate action and climate justice, we need to go back to historical tenets and look at the root cause of this problem and how each indigenous communities, whether in Asia, whether in Latin America, whether in the Pacific, recalibrate by going back to your roots and understanding, the regional approaches to addressing climate change that would actually dissociate, at least to a certain optimal level, colonialist and racism in that response. Thank you. I'll leave at that junction, and we're still going to address some issues. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, for your very passionate. We can feel the energy, the anger. We can feel the intensity of your sharing. Thanks for the history lesson, but thanks also for the analysis of the neo-colonialism, as you called it, that is happening now in Africa, and it's also happening in the climate response. And hopefully later on we can think of what are the solutions. And you already started talking about indigenous solutions. Maybe later on we can explore that even further once if we still have more time. But thank you so much, Kenneth. Now we'll hear from the last panelist. Again, I just want to remind our participants, please ask your questions. We'll make sure that they're asked during the open forum. And now we'll hear from Sandeep Maharaj from the University of West Indies in the Caribbean. Sandeep, thank you, and we look forward to hearing your perspectives and stories.
Hi, a pleasant good day, depending on where you are, be it 2 a.m. tomorrow morning or at the moment here in Trinidad where we're at 10 a.m. I'll be very brief. I have 5 minutes, Renzo, and he did not tell me about slides, so I prepared some for you still. And I wish to speak basically on this very sensitive topic of climate change. And sorry about that. And this is what happens when we share. We do share things when we did not prepare, but sorry. So I will like to begin my slideshow here from the beginning. And I want to say, if you all are seeing this, today, more than likely, this would have been the Caribbean person speaking to you. These are forgotten people that started in that 1942 trip that Kenneth spoke about. And
Sandeep,
they were,
Sandeep,
are you hearing me?
Sorry to interrupt you. We can see a black or a gray box covering the photo. So I'm not sure if maybe you have another window that is open.
Sorry, no, that's the screen. But don't worry, I won't do the slides again. But okay. I'll just do that live because we didn't prepare. But basically, the Caribbean region has been one of the regions that has been most affected by climate change. It's a region that has, as said by the IMF, most vulnerable to climate change. But at the same time, it is also a region that is vulnerable to economic harsh realities. As I don't know if you saw my picture earlier on showing some indigenous people, but really and truly in 1942, when Christopher Columbus was trying to find a route to India, he actually found a route within the Caribbean, and the people he found there actually named them Indians. Today, most of that generation is lost in the Caribbean region. The Caribbean region, as of May 2024, would have seen some of the most devastating hurricanes that would have ever hit this region. And more importantly, beyond those hurricanes, which I would have liked to show, is that we have charted somewhat our own destiny via colonialization and racism. My dear friends, Eric Williams in 1962 would have written in his thesis, Capitalism and Slavery, how the backs of the Industrial Revolution was funded out of slavery coming out of the Caribbean region. And it is well documented, the Anthropocene, or the age that we live in, where we have all of this CO2 being released into the atmosphere, was based and developed out of that age of the Industrial Revolution. Hence, truly, the Caribbean sits at the heart and somewhat of this nexus when it comes to racism, climate change, and justice. And we felt it very much so because the first presenter very clearly and well articulated how structural racism is well developed and ingrained, and they all impact the social determinants of health. Our health education training is based on a colonial model at the end of the day in the Caribbean. Also, and we felt the effects of that when the EU came in place. There were no longer spaces for persons to do their postgraduate training in the UK. Beyond our health system models, our dependency on getting medications, for example, during COVID-19, with the vaccine apartheid, the Caribbean region was one of the last when 8th of December 2020, the first person got their vaccine in the United Kingdom. The Caribbean got its first delivery of vaccines via donation from India on the 21st of February, 2021. Almost 2 months later, we did not even have the ability to utilize our own capital to deal with our own health status. My dear friends, this is the reality of what structural systems can have. Racism may not necessarily be only the color of the skin, but it can also mainly be developed and ingrained into systems that are not actually intended to be racist at the end of the day. So we really need to look deeper. I mean, I'm looking forward to your questions. I had a lot more to share, but I'm looking at time as well here today. But finally, I would like to state that the positive side of all of this, it gives us the opportunity to open our eyes to where the inequities lie and how we can innovate, create, and recreate a better tomorrow that will try to deal with these inequities and bring them to scale. My final point is I'd like to congratulate the O'Neill Commission when I recognized there was not a Caribbean person, and I think I thought deeply about it. On the panel, I wrote, and there's a Lancet article out there about that, and I must give a lot of kudos to Sir Horton for transparently putting it out there, and then finding somebody to basically represent the Caribbean region on the panel. And that in its sense is a start, and it's a positive start for us moving things forward. So Renzo, I will not go more. I know I'm out of time now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. And just that last thing that you shared with us, it's just a concrete example. You know, if we say something and if we speak up, if we write it somewhere, right, then it can really make a difference. It can you know, make changes. And we're very grateful to you for calling out the lack of Caribbean representation in the commission, which I think is a very good segue to a short Slido exercise that we will do now, because we want to make sure that audience or our participants are also get to contribute to the discussion. And please, you know, use this QR code or enter that code in the slido.com link. And here is the first question. Sandeep was mentioning already, and in a way, our other panelists highlighted the lack of inclusion, participation, diversity in our policy spaces, etc. You know, I'm just curious, from your perspective, whose voices have we not heard yet tonight? Because we'll make sure that in our future conversations, you know, these communities, whether they're geographic communities, racialized communities, I'm seeing here trans folks, you know, the LGBT community, you know, all the different communities that, you know, unfortunately, we cannot represent them all in this panel, but we would love to hear from you. Who else do you think should be in this conversation and should be part, you know, of the broader climate and health discourse? So we are appreciating the answers that we're now seeing in more indigenous voices. Certainly, we'll make sure that we bring them in and create the spaces moving forward. Any other answers to this question? Okay, policymakers, people with disability, living with disabilities. You know, we have young people here in this panel, but maybe we need more because they are the ones who will, unfortunately, be going to be affected by the climate crisis throughout their lifespan. We're seeing also here women and children, you know, Black women, Latin America, okay? Funders. We should also bring in the funders to this conversation and many others. Thank you so much. Now, let's move on to the next question. And again, we are keeping a record of your answers. You know, in the past more than an hour, we already kind of touched on many different aspects of this big elephant that we've been talking about, the intersection of racism, colonialism, health inequalities, the climate crisis, etc. We would love to hear from you. What do you think are some anti-racial and decolonial solutions that we can do, that we can deploy in order to fight climate change and health injustice? So we don't want to be the only one speaking and talking about solutions. Maybe you also have some ideas that can help enrich our discussion or conversation. Incentivize or mandate climate action in funding policies. Go back to indigenous knowledge. Implement UNDRIP. I'm not sure what it means. If that person can put it in the Q&A, that will be great. Maybe the panelists know about it. Learning about history. So I think that's one key message. All of us should be studying about our past, because if we don't do so, we are doomed to repeat it. And then call for greater integrity among politicians and multinational companies. A while ago, Susana's experience and stories really captured, the power and the disproportionate power of politicians and corporations in, perpetuating injustice, environmental racism, ecological destruction. Okay, now I see, of course, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that's UNDRIP, and climate reparations. Maybe we can ask the panel for their thoughts. And as you know, just last year, the Loss and Damage Fund was created under the auspices of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Some were calling it as a climate reparations fund. Do you feel hopeful about this fund, right? In fact, the Philippines, my home country, was selected as the host of the board of the Loss and Damage Fund, and bring all countries to the table, especially small island states. Well, when we go to COP, I'm not going to COP this year, but when you go to COP, you definitely will see voices, representation from different parts of the world. But is that enough? That we have, 1, 2, 3 representatives from these different countries when decisions are being made by the powerful countries, which tend to have larger delegations, but also, an army of lobbyists and corporate actors and many other, elements and stakeholders. Integrate environmental justice into climate action in the built environment. So we need to make sure when we design or redesign our cities, when we transform our food systems, environmental justice is a core, principle or tenet. It can't be an afterthought or something we just, add because, it's the trend, right? It should be at the very heart. Educate younger generation, expand our idea of knowledge and education. I think part of it is also to do more research. And that's why Mita's work on doing research around environmental inequities is certainly important. We need the numbers. We also need the stories. And we've heard a lot of stories. We've seen a short trailer of a full-length film capturing the stories of the Forgotten Pacific. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And please keep on entering your answers to this question because, again, we have 15 minutes remaining, and we want these 15 minutes to be the 15 minutes of solutions, right? And we've done the diagnosis already. We've done the storytelling. What are the solutions? And maybe let's start, with COP29, right? It's coming in a few weeks' time. I mentioned the loss and damage fund. Is it the appropriate and acceptable form of quote unquote reparations for the damage and the losses already experienced by developing countries, by the global south, due to the emissions coming from the global north? Are you hopeful with the upcoming COP negotiations? It's interesting. Even the COP29 has not even happened yet, and people are now preparing for COP30 in Brazil, maybe COP31, which will be jointly hosted by Australia and the Pacific. So do we need to keep on counting COPs and delay true climate action? In fact, we have one question also regarding COP here. Anyone who would like to take a stab? Comments on the climate negotiations? Sandeep, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, reparations and quantification of reparations will always be a major issue. And really and truly, I think one of the biggest things that COP needs to focus on is how do we innovate ourselves out of this problem? Because it's a major problem. And we all know the big issue is changing of lifestyle, reduction of CO2, but also bringing equity to the table. And the way to deal with big problems are really by innovative solutions. Because in economics, sometime back when I was a student, although a pharmacist, we always learned that humans want to always consume more or be better off than they were previously. So really controlling consumption is very difficult. And the best way to deal with that is via innovation. So I really do think one of the big agendas beside reparations, I think those are important and we need to correct wrongs that happened. But how do we correct them and make them most meaningful is a discussion for elsewhere. But what I would clearly state is that we need to also put the innovative response on the table to get us moving forward and moving quickly. Thanks, Renzo.
Thank you, Sandeep. There's a comment here. If we want to talk about innovations, we need to have corporations to be part of the table of discussion. And although you mentioned also that we need to get out of this system, right? And that's innovation, right? Thinking out of the box. How can we escape from this toxic system that we created for ourselves? The economic system, the political system, rooted in those, that historical colonialism that maybe it has evolved into new forms of colonialism. A while ago, there was a comment on capitalism. I wonder if we have other colleagues here who would like to comment on these issues. I know, Susana, you told us a lot of stories, some successes, some setbacks or failures, the influence of corporations in the States and government as well. And maybe this is a way to connect the discussion to what is about to happen next week, right? Or in 2 weeks' time, the elections in the States. Are you hopeful? What do you see is the future of environmental activism in America and the world?
Yeah, I think that we're in a real crisis because we saw when former President Trump was elected, how he rolled back all of the environmental policies, how he impacted all the health care that could be available. And basically what he did was making sure that the poor and majority people of color continue to suffer, but he also had a very racist ideology. He was always attacking whether it was Latinos, Haitians, African American, there was a constant barrage of hate in his whole ideology. And so, yes, we are a very scary crisis time because U.S. always talks about dictatorships in other countries and what has happened, and yet we have someone who is actually in that role who wants to become a dictator if elected. And so when we look at how, President Trump, former President Trump is running, and how it would be so much impactful, not just for humanity, but for the whole Mother Earth, for the resources that would bring so much damage that when if he is elected, it took us back so far back because not only here, but globally, the policies, all the so-called, fair trades and so much, how that impacted the whole world. And I do, I did want to add that, we talk a lot about gentrification, but gentrification is the new word for colonization. So I want to make that clear that when you hear me say gentrification, I'm really talking about colonization that is happening here in the United States, but all over the world where it's happening also. So yeah, we are on pins and needles because of the elections, and I just can't wait for it to be over. Hopefully, we don't get President Trump elected because of where his stands are on across all issues. But I think that us working to put together a multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic world would be greatly impacted by these elections if President Trump was elected.
Thank you so much, Susanna. And you mentioned the domestic colonization in the form of gentrification, but there's still international or transnational colonialism or colonization happening.
Yes.
I think we will remiss to not mention all the wars that are still happening in the different parts of the world, notably Gaza, but other regions of the world. And these are also communities that are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. So it's, in a way, multiple layers of colonialism through military might, but also through carbon emissions and the climate impacts, but also economic, right? I think one of you mentioned also the economic colonization that is still happening today through the policies, the trade agreements, and that keep the poor and that continue to enrich the rich. I just want to read a few more questions here, and there are two related questions. One is how to incorporate the spirituality and indigenous knowledge into climate action. And there's one specific question from the Philippines, which, as we speak, is in the middle of a severe tropical storm. Sana Salceda is actually addressing the question to Elizabeth. Maybe you've seen some indigenous practices in the forgotten Pacific that other archipelagic and island countries like the Philippines can learn from. So I think these two related questions, it's for Elizabeth, but also for Kenneth. Let's have Elizabeth first and then Kenneth.
I think I'll use Futuna is a island in Vanuatu. It's a rocky island, about 600 population. There's no roads, no cars, no tourism, so they kind of walk everywhere. There's about 6 villages, and Vanuatu have faced like severe tropical cyclones. Last year, they had 2 Category 5s within 2 days that ravaged the whole of Vanuatu. And in terms of like the indigenous knowledge that the community of Futuna have been practicing, because of the regularity of these cyclones, they have been preparing their food in advance and putting it into the ground now. So they've been harvesting the food, wrapping it in banana leaves, digging it into the ground so then it can withstand the tropical cyclone. They've also gone back to blending their indigenous houses with modern material because their houses are quite low. So they're about, I think, 2 meters off the ground, and they're like little triangles that they've been kind of going back to because they've realized that having the Western houses easily can like get damaged, and then they cause injury because they're made of corrugated iron. So they've been using a lot of bamboo and local wood to make their houses. So these are some of the practices that they have been doing that we have featured in the documentary that we've seen. And they're one of the islands that have really been practicing indigenous knowledge with fishing, planting by the moon, fishing where they need to just because they're trying to also protect their natural resources. I don't know if that answers the question, but those are just some of the practices that we managed to see through the filming.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm sure there's much more, right? And sadly, we don't have time to capture all of these indigenous practices. Kenneth, some thoughts from your experience in Africa?
Yeah, thank you again, Renzo. I think I also buy some of the indigenous strategies Elizabeth just talked about. And it's interesting that indigenous knowledge all over the world, there are lots and lots of intersection. I think basically here in Africa, they are going back to look at the indigenous trees and plants that they have and to sort of like, scale up the growth of these indigenous plants because previously, some of these plants were actually cut down due to deforestation and excess logging and selling to other countries to buy. So they are going back. And one of such example is eucalyptus. Eucalyptus is not an indigenous tree in Africa. So now they're going back to indigenous trees as well. And then also going back to sustainable agriculture. And then also planting plants that prevent erosion, quite a number of them. We've been able to capture case studies across sub-Saharan Africa where communities are actually growing plants that prevent erosion of the soil and all that. And also indigenous knowledge with respect to growing traditional plants for treating their diseases. So, but the final thought is we've come up with an emergency prepared toolkit for sub-Saharan Africa right now. Just about 3 weeks ago, which actually profiles the various indigenous knowledge in flood-prone areas and areas where there's heat elevation and all that stuff in order to improve their coping strategy and to prepare them for these kinds of events. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. I just want to ask Mita a question. You've heard the responses from our participants, potential solutions to fighting racism, climate change, and health inequalities. You've heard some of the issues around global governance, domestic policies, indigenous knowledge systems. What do you think, as a researcher, is the future research agenda? What are your takeaways? What kinds of research needs to be done, research questions that need to be pursued? How can we do research in a better way, in a way that really walks the talk? Maybe you have some thoughts.
There's so much to say on this. I'll start with, we have to address discrimination in the fight for climate change, or against climate change. We need to foreground anti-racism in climate and health in particular. Solutions have to be grounded in transformative justice and human rights. This means placing the needs and perspectives of those on the margins at the center while focusing on dismantling the systems of power which perpetuate the inequities. For research, it's challenging. I think Kenneth echoed some really important points about the way that research is done, the perspectives that are valued in the research community, and how they believe these things should be unfolded. Oftentimes goes against the grains of what needs to happen, but at the same time dominates the way that we validate and kind of process our bureaucracy and our kind of evidence base. But I'll go on a tangent if I keep talking about that. Research priorities in particular should reflect a transformative approach. Voices and solutions of MAPA, so the most effective peoples and areas, need to take precedence, and their lives and experiences and expertise should guide the research process, ensuring that solutions are both representative and empowering. This involves using transformation, mixed methods research designs that advance critical and emancipatory work. By combining qualitative and quantitative research, researchers can be more inclusive, cross-disciplinary, collaborative, and are better situated to incorporate the insights of MAPA communities who aren't involved in research and face the harshest impacts of climate change. There's also a need to expand the body of literature on how climate change impacts marginalized communities globally. As I said, it's currently mostly the US. And there needs to be adequate evaluative research on the impacts that removing discrimination from climate action and how that can actually impact health. That's kind of a whistle-stop tour of what can be done. Yeah, over to you, Renzo.
Yep. In short, we have lots to do still, right? Even in the academic realm, because I understand some of our participants here are from the different universities. So I think that enumeration of things to do that you just gave is certainly very helpful in shaping the future of climate, health, and equity research. You know, it's hard to cover so many different topics, even in an hour-and-a-half session. We need to also let Elizabeth go to bed. It's 3:30 a.m. Thank you so much for your strength and endurance. But of course, thanks to our wonderful panelists, Mita, Susanna, Elizabeth, Kenneth, and Sandeep. Thanks also to our participants who contributed to the discussion, who listened to the conversation. I hope that you were able to draw wisdom and lessons that you can bring to your work in fighting climate change and health inequalities and racism and colonialism. Thanks, of course, to our team at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law, the Secretariat of the O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health, for helping us organize this successful webinar. Wow, and thank you again to everybody. Unfortunately, we've colonized the atmosphere. We've also colonized the oceans. I think there was a powerful quote from the trailer of the Forgotten Pacific a while ago. We've colonized peoples. We continue to colonize our communities in many different ways and forms. And now, as Mita has highlighted, we need to center these discussions, these issues in our work on climate and health, and in addressing the pressing health issues that we face both domestically but also internationally, worldwide. This discussion is going to be very helpful to us in the commission as we finalize the report. And we cannot really survive this warming planet while turning a blind eye to racism, health inequality, and injustice. I think that's the message also of this webinar. So thank you again. Have a good day and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Renzo.
Thank you.
Thank you.